Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise. I just want to give you a heads up. You're going to be with me for a while today. This is one of the most craziest cases I think I've ever heard. It is absolutely wild. I honestly have no idea how I haven't heard of it until now. But it's a long one, guys, so you are definitely going to be with me for a minute. So make sure you're comfy, make sure you've got your fuzzy socks on, your froyo, a cocktail, coffee, whatever it is, whatever thing you need to just get yourself into the right zone right now, take a pause and go grab it, because you're going to be with me for a minute. So I want to talk to you about this case because, like I said, it's one of the most bizarre cases that I think I've ever heard in my entire life. But it has to do with lust, infidelity, distrust, abandonment, and these are some of the common things that really come to mind as well when we hear about cases of killer couples wanting to be together so badly that they would do absolutely anything to anyone who tries to stop them. Now, something we're not as used to, though, is when religion becomes a key player in their cruel and vicious ways. Well, unless you're Lori and Chad Daybell, I should say. Now, this is a very unique case, a case that is the only one of 3 known cases like it in all of the 250 years of the Amish community. And guys, it is a wild one. So let's jump right in. All right, guys, so the other day I made it my mission to cancel one of my subscriptions. I called, I waited on hold, then I finally talked to somebody, but I never canceled. You see, I hate confrontation, and when it comes to negotiating or canceling a service, I just avoid it at all costs. Actually, it not only has made me keep subscriptions longer than I want to, but I usually add things on. I get the add-on thing and somehow get talked into it. So ultimately, I'm just paying more for bills on services that I probably shouldn't even use, and ultimately, I'm just wasting money. But thank goodness for Rocket Money, because they are here to help. Rocket Money is the personal finance app that helps you cancel subscriptions, lower your bills, and manage your money better. Now for me, my love affair with Rocket Money started with my subscriptions, because I have so many one-time apps that I have just downloaded that automatically renew the subscription that I now still have over a year later. And it is just the worst. I didn't even know that I still had them. I don't even know where they came from. But Rocket Money safely and securely identifies these recurring charges, and then they cancel the unwanted subscriptions for you. You can even cancel from within the app with just a couple of taps. It is so easy. So there's no need to worry about the customer service calls, facing these uncomfy, cringy conversations. It is so easy. Rocket Money has helped save its customers an average of $720 a year, and with over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. Now, what sealed the deal for me that Rocket Money is like my Valentine's Day soulmate is that they also helped me lower my monthly bills, the ones that I didn't cancel, the ones that I still had. Simply by uploading a photo of your bill and tapping a few buttons, Rocket Money will negotiate your bills for you, from internet service to cable, phone bills, you name it. I mean, honestly, who doesn't want to save money? And save money on things you didn't even remember you had, which I'm guilty. Facetune, the Pro app, I didn't even know I had it. I used it for one picture when I was looking a little tired. Here I am months later and I'm still paying for it. To try Rocket Money out today and unlock more features with premium, head to rocketmoney.com/10tolife or click that link in my description. Thank you, Rocket Money, for sponsoring today's video. In 2009, 30-year-old Barbara Weaver, born Barbara Miller, was living in Apple Creek, Ohio, which is a village that is part of the Ohio Amish community. People from all over Ohio and the surrounding states travel to experience some of the local goods and attractions in this Amish country. Now, Apple Creek is an extremely small area too, hence why it's considered a village instead of a town or a city. The population in the 2020 census showed that there were actually only a little over 1,100 people residing there. So like I said, it's a very small area. Growing up, Barbara was part of a large family that held very strong and traditional Amish values. Her family was part of the Andy Weaver sect, which is a subgroup of the Old Order Amish, and it is much more conservative and strict than others. They held very strict beliefs on things like driving, facial hair, hair length, electricity, and just so much more. And she was never one to question the faith at any point. And her biggest hopes and her dreams were to become a wife and a mother one day. She was described as being very quiet, very soft-spoken, but she also loved to read. She loved just diving into a good book. And her favorite things to read were Amish and other Christian romance novels. This just kind of made her dream even more about becoming a wife and a mother someday. And it just really, I don't want to say illuminated it, but it really just kind of made it feel fairy tale-y, if that makes sense. So she was also described by her friends and her family as just being beyond beautiful. Beautiful, dirty blonde hair, freckles along her nose and face, just truly stunning. Now, 1998 was Barbara's year, and it was her year specifically that made her believe in these fairy tale novel-type romances. And that is when she met a man named Eli Weaver. Eli was also part of the Old Order Amish. His dad and his brother were actually ministers in the community, so those strict beliefs and values that Barbara had were absolutely nothing new to him. If anything, he understood possibly even more than anybody else would. So it wasn't long after they met that they realized that there was actually more to just liking each other, because friends and neighbors said that their personalities just really seemed to mesh so well. While Barbara was laid back, reserved, kind of quiet, Eli was outgoing, and he could really spark up a conversation with a complete stranger. Now, when you're dating in the Amish community, it isn't really something that allows you a lot of private time to get to know one another. It's mainly group activities, things that involve more of the religion, things like that. But the two of them still spent many days and many hours with each other during the year that they dated. They would go on every single weekend to something called Sunday evening singings, which was where single young Amish members would come together. They would sing, they would eat dinner, and they would just socialize and try to meet potential friends, partners, whatever you would, I guess, end up sparking with whoever you met. So the two of them ended up courting for a year before they finally got married in May of 1999. Now, Barbara loved the role of being a wife and wanted more than anything to be a mother. Remember, that was her dream. So because of that, they ended up having 5 kids together within the first 7 years of marriage. And Barbara was overjoyed that she had finally found her version of happily ever after, right? Except there was one big problem. For Barbara and Eli, the happy-go-lucky honeymoon stage did not last for long. You see, just a few years into their marriage, Eli began having affairs, and his behavior towards Barbara seemingly started to escalate. He owned a gun store, and he also made a pretty decent living. And one thing that he loved was having control over Barbara in every single possible way. He refused to let her handle any of the family's money, even if it was just to buy groceries for household basics or necessities or things like that, or even little things for the kids. It wouldn't happen, not on his watch. And it didn't end there, because over time, things began to get more physical. The children claimed that on many occasions they witnessed their father physically assaulting their mother, hitting her and shoving her all around. Now again, Barbara was very strict in her faith, and she never wavered on that. So she never even thought of asking for help, or even thought that what was happening wasn't her fault. A bishop within their church even had said that if she would have gone to one of the leaders, they probably wouldn't have even asked her what Eli did, but rather what she did to make him do that to her. So Barbara kept quiet. She raised the kids, and she made sure that everything in the house ran smoothly, or I guess as smoothly as she could. Now, there was a very big difference, too, in the way that Eli and Barbara were living out their faith. You see, Barbara trusted and believed in everything that she was taught growing up. She never questioned why they couldn't drive or have cell phones, and she put all of her trust and her faith into the word of this religion. Now, Eli, on the other hand, was somebody who was very easily tempted by the thought of living in a less strict and conservative world, and it was something that he had struggled with pretty much his whole life. 2 times during their marriage, he completely up and left the family and the Amish community. He wanted the luxuries of electric cars, cell phones, and even the possibility of the different kinds of social interactions that he could have. especially with women, which obviously this was a huge no-no for the Amish community. And when he left, he was shunned by the entire community. Both times, though, he didn't stay gone for long, only a few months at a time before he would come running back, begging for forgiveness, which was always granted to him. He found out that living life on the outside world wasn't necessarily as easy or as lavish as he had expected it to be, but the temptations were still something that he struggled with every single day, even after he returned back home to Barbara. Now, despite all of these problems, Barbara kept a smile on her face, and she never complained. The one good thing that had come from her life with Eli was her children. She loved her children more than anything in the world. Yes, being a wife may not have ended up being how she had imagined, but being a mother, on the other hand, was everything that she had hoped for and more. She was also a very gentle parent. If her kids were doing something that they weren't supposed to, she never yelled, she never got impatient, she never got upset. She would simply explain to them why it was wrong and what they needed to do in order to be better. Her kids loved her, they looked up to her, they respected her. Now, Barbara was very close with her sister, Fanny Troyer, and one thing that they had in common was that they were both mothers, and this was something that the two of them really enjoyed bonding over. Barbara had 5 kids, and Fanny had 4. Now, both groups of kids were under the ages of 9, so the families spent a lot of time together, enjoying the company of their cousins and really just helping each other out. They say that it takes a village, and Barbara and Fanny were definitely each other's villages. Now, during one of the times that Eli had left the community in 2006, Barbara had actually moved her and the kids from the home that she and Eli had been living in to a home that was only 3 miles away from where Fanny and her family lived. And she did that so that they could all be closer and just really have a better support system. So as you can tell, they were more than just sisters. They were more like best friends. Now, one of Barbara's favorite things to do was keep a journal. Her journal was her escape from the world, and it's where she wrote down every feeling and every thought that she had. She often talked about her marriage and the struggle that it had been, and she described Eli's behaviors many of the times, and she would say things like, "Where did my friend go? My love, my trustworthy husband, where did he go? He hates me to the core." She would also write, "There's been no true repentance expressed since a year ago when he got caught." So it's truly heartbreaking seeing some of the things that she wrote, because you can just tell that she loved him with everything in her, despite everything that he had done to her and that he continued to do. Now, June 1st, 2009 was a very stormy summer day. 4 of Barbara's kids and 2 of Fanny's kids were over at the Weaver house. The kids had been playing together all day, and they were planning on having a sleepover later that night. It had just been Barbara at home taking care of the kids that night, which wasn't a whole lot different, honestly, than usual. Even after Eli had come back to the community, he still didn't really spend much time with his family. It was almost more of a shock if he was home rather than if he wasn't. Now, like I said, it was a very stormy summer night, so that night there was a huge thunderstorm. The kids were all still pretty young, so when it began thundering pretty loudly outside, they all got a little bit scared, like kids do, and they all decided to sleep downstairs, closer to the master bedroom where Barbara was at. So her being closer would have just been like a huge comfort to them. They all knew that she would never let anything bad happen to them and would be there for them if they got too scared. The next morning, however, something immediately felt very off. Now, Barbara usually woke up pretty early, before any of the kids ever woke up, so that she could have a little bit of me time. She loved starting the mornings the exact same way. She'd get up, she'd write in her journal, she would start tidying up around the house before the chaos of the day just really kicked in. This morning in particular, though, when the kids woke up, all was quiet. Too quiet. At some point in the night or early morning, Eli had gotten home, and he had carried 3 of the younger kids back upstairs after they had fallen asleep. Fanny's oldest girl, named Susie, was still downstairs when she woke up on the couch. Now, keep in mind, all of the kids were under the age of 9. So Susie still wasn't very old. When she woke up, though, she noticed that her aunt hadn't been up doing her usual chores or even taking care of the baby, 2-year-old little Lizzie. She thought that since she had obviously woken up before her aunt, which never happened anytime she ever spent the night, she was going to surprise her by helping out and getting some things done around the house. So as she was trying to get everything done and handled before Barbara woke up, she heard the younger kids, Harley, Sarah, and Joseph, start screaming. And they were screaming in a way that was unlike anything she had ever heard before. When she followed the screams and the cries of her cousins and her siblings, it led her right to Barbara and Eli's room. But Eli wasn't there. He had apparently already left for a fishing trip that he had planned with some buddies of his in Lake Erie. So instead, when she went inside of the room, she saw why Barbara had not been up taking care of things around the house, awake, or calming baby Lizzie before the sun was up like she always did. Barbara was laying in bed, almost like she was peacefully sleeping, but the blood that was all over her nightgown and all over the bedding told the kids that she wasn't sleeping at all, and something horribly sinister had happened to Barbara. The kids, still just so young, were now alone and also in denial that something had happened to Barbara. But when they touched her, her body was freezing cold. Her eyes were shut, and her lips looked a bluish-yellowish tint. Now, thankfully, they had been taught what to do in case of an emergency and who to go to. Now, by this time, one of Barbara and Eli's sons had also woken up, and after he saw that something was seriously wrong, he booked it out of the house, and he ran to the nearest neighbor's house to ask for help. So a couple by the name of Linda and Furman Yoder lived next door. Linda heard the panic and the cries from the young boy's voice, and she ran into the house, completely unaware of what she would be walking into. When she went into Barbara and Eli's room, she knew as the first adult who had been on the scene that Barbara had very clearly been shot and that she was more than likely already dead. But remember, because the Amish don't have personal cell phones, there wasn't much that Linda could immediately do on her person. So Linda had to run to a place where they kept a landline phone for anyone in the community to use in the event of emergency. And that's when she called 911.
911, do you have an emergency?
Yes, we do.
At what address?
Person not responding.
Okay, do you know if the person's breathing?
No.
Okay, you mean you don't know or they're not breathing?
I don't think she's breathing.
But when the ambulance arrived, they knew that it was too late. Barbara had no pulse, and she was declared dead on the scene at just 30 years old. Just hours before this, Barbara had been comforting the kids through the storm, rocking the baby to sleep, and then heading to bed, eager for what the next day would bring. And somebody, somehow, had just stripped that all away from her. Now, one thing was clear. This was fully a clear-cut murder. But who killed Barbara? When investigators got to the crime scene, they quickly saw a gunshot wound on the right side of her chest. They noticed that there were burn holes in the blankets from the muzzle burn of the gun, which is something that would have happened if the gun was shot in extremely close range. They weren't able to say with 100% certainty until the medical examiner looked at the body, but from the size of the hole that they could see, it looked as though she had possibly been shot by a shotgun. They also noticed what looked to be slight bruising and scratches around Barbara's hands and arms. So were these defensive wounds, or were these like the leftover wounds from a previous argument that she maybe had with Eli? Now, as if seeing Barbara dead wasn't traumatic enough for the kids, Barbara's son Harley was able to tell when he saw her that she had been shot. Harley had woken up in the middle of the night to what he thought was just very loud thunder from the storm. But when he saw the blood and the wound on his mom in the morning, he thought back to the guns that he had been around at his dad's gun shop his whole life, and how those sounded when they went off. And he started to realize it probably wasn't thunder that he had heard. He had heard his mom being shot, even though he didn't know at the time that that was the sound he had heard. And even worse, this traumatic event took place just 2 days after his 9th birthday. So something they needed to rule out was the possibility of this being self-inflicted, right? Ruling that out was a pretty easy first step, though, for two main reasons. The first was that there was no weapon found on the scene. If she had tried to take her own life herself, then the gun still would have been in bed with her, or at the very least it would have fallen on the ground near the bed. The second was when they tested her hands for gunshot residue, the tests all came back negative. So the time of death was estimated to be about 2 a.m., but a window of 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. was given. 11 items were taken as evidence from the crime scene, and some of the items that were taken were nail clippings, hair samples, fingerprints, DNA evidence, and even shot pellets. So police knew that they were now looking at a homicide case, but they were confused on what the motive could have even been because Barbara was a respectable and lovable woman. Someone like her being killed seemed impossible to imagine. The first option when something like this happens is usually a home break-in or a robbery type situation, but one quick sweep through the house had them crossing possible burglary off the list completely, because there were no signs of forced entry, not on any of the doors, not on any of the windows. Nothing seemed out of place or a mess or like somebody had been rummaging through any of their things in a hurry to just like smash and grab and go. There had even been some cash that was laid out in the wide open in multiple places. So surely if somebody had been breaking in for money, for valuables, for anything like that, they definitely would have grabbed the cash, right? It's even stranger that all of the people in the home, out of all of them, Barbara was the only person who was shot. It all just seemed very, very personal. So the next option investigators began looking into was, of course, Eli, the spouse, who wasn't even present when the kids found her dead. They knew that he had those plans to go on that fishing trip, but what are the odds on the night that he wakes up early to leave on a trip, Barbara is also killed at home in the bed that he should have also been in? So was it a coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. So word about Barbara's death spread around the community like absolute wildfire. And luckily, one of the men who was on that fishing trip with Eli wasn't Amish, and he had a cell phone on him. So detectives were able to contact him and tell him the news about his wife. Lake Erie was only about an hour and a half from home, so they all packed up their things and Eli agreed to come into the police station for questioning. When Eli arrived at the station 4 hours later, the investigators explained a little bit more to him about what had happened to his wife, as well as some of the things that had taken place that morning, including his own children and his niece seeing Barbara in the state that she was in. Now, his reaction to the news was less than upset. One of the detectives on the case, named John Chewy, wrote in their notes, quote, "It should be noted that during the interview with Eli, he was found to show very little emotion for someone who just learned about losing their wife that morning." He also wrote that he had a very casual attitude during the interview, even when they explained to him that as the husband, they were going to have to be looking a little bit heavier into him than anybody else, until it was proven that they needed to focus elsewhere. So Eli told the police that the night before, he had gotten home from one of his fishing trips pretty late, around 11 p.m. He had planned to get a few hours of sleep, then get back up and head to Lake Erie for another fishing trip. He said that when he got home, he carried a few of the sleeping kids upstairs and then tucked them into bed before getting in and settling in for the night himself. He claimed that he was so worn out that he actually overslept that morning, waking up way later than he had even meant to. He also said that Barbara had woken him up that morning to make sure that she was able to see him and tell him goodbye before he headed out again. He said that he packed up his things, told Barbara goodbye, and then left. Now, because he left so early, Barbara was up much earlier than she usually woke up. So when he saw her in the bedroom by the bed as he left, he figured that she was just going to head back to bed, go back to sleep until her usual wake-up time. And he said that that was the last time that he saw her alive. So the investigators just straight up asked him during his interview if he had anything to do with her death, and he denied it each and every time. He claimed to be just as shocked and confused and upset as everybody else was. And we know that when things like this happen, the first person police look at is usually always the husband. Plus, his previous violent and controlling behavior toward Barbara and his infidelity, combined with him leaving town right before she was killed, was more than suspicious. Now, he might have looked suspicious, still there wasn't much proof, but that didn't mean that they were completely sure of his innocence either. His alibi, however, held up, and each person that he was on that fishing trip with confirmed the exact same thing through all of their separate interviews. So even though his alibi seemed pretty airtight, they did know that there could be a possibility of his friends lying for him. So they needed something to be a little bit stronger to fully be able to rule out him as a possible suspect. The investigators knew that if they tested him for gunshot residue and it came back positive, the rest of the case would be fairly easy. Case closed, right? And when they asked Eli to do a test on his hands, he was more than willing. But when the results came back, they were absolutely stunned and even a little bit confused because the results were negative. Now, a lot of them in the back of their minds just assumed that it would come back positive, but there were no traces of gunshot residue on his hands whatsoever. So they were back to square one, right where they started. Barbara's sister Fanny came in to talk with police since she was the one who truly knew everything about Barbara. It was her best friend. She knew everything about her. And when I say that she spilled the tea on Eli's entire life over the course of the past 10 years that she had known him, I mean, she spilled the mother effing tea, guys. She told investigators that Eli's infidelity and wandering eyes hadn't just been an issue in their marriage. It had actually started long before, when they were both teenagers and still dating. Apparently, Eli always had a little bit of a wild side. During his teenage years, he would go to these parties and hang out with people, drink with other people outside of the Amish community, while Barbara never once even wished for a life outside of the community. Eli, though, had been yearning for it as long as he could remember, and he had always been tempted by the, quote, sins of the outside world. Fanny claimed that for as long as she had known Eli, he was always getting out of trouble that he got himself into, and also that his parents always stood by his side and basically just swept things under the rug for him. Now, I'm not sure how leaving the community and rejoining it works, but it does make me wonder if having multiple family members as ministers did help with him rejoining after he had fled. Now, like I said, I don't know for sure. Maybe it's a fairly simple process to come back into that specific community after leaving for a period of time if maybe you repent. I don't know, but it does make you wonder, right? Now, in kind of a gross, if not gross, at minimum tactless thing, in the days after Barbara's death, Eli's parents were allegedly overheard saying that they had no idea who could do something like this to Eli, as if it wasn't Barbara who had just lost her life. And if that really is what they said, it just shows how they felt like Eli could do no wrong, and how he would be the sole victim in this, and how the whole world just revolved around him and only him. No mention of their grandkids who had to witness their mother's lifeless body, but poor little Eli, who was gone at the time and wasn't even the one who found her and constantly was either away from the home or having affairs and being unloyal in their marriage. I mean, poor Eli, right? I mean, just saying. So Fanny told detectives that she felt that based on the things that Barbara had confided in her about, it seemed like Eli had forced her into sex on more occasions than one, and even speculated that her scratches and bruises could have been from that rather than the murder, though it was something that was never confirmed. Something Eli had apparently always begged Barbara for was oral sex, even though she wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. Fanny also told detectives that the last time that Eli had left, he left Barbara and the kids with absolutely no money. Remember, he had always controlled the money for the family, but even though he was leaving them with no source of income or ways to buy food, he apparently had no remorse, no empathy. And Barbara had once written about moments like this in her journal, saying, "This is now Friday, and I need to send the boys to the store today. But Eli forgot to lay me out money and then went to Lake Erie at 3:30 a.m. to fish." I mean, just a piece of shit guy, right? So during the last time he left the family, things had gotten so bad financially for Barbara and the kids that people in the community even began to worry. So they knew that they were literally scraping by. So they raised $6,000 for Barbara. And it was with this money that she was able to move closer to Fanny and be able to give kids the food and basic necessities that she needed to. But once Eli came back after a few months, Fanny claimed that he took every last dime of what Barbara had left of that $6,000 that she was given. Now, one of the most significant things that Fanny told the investigators was that not too long before Barbara's death, she had told Fanny that she had a bad feeling about Eli again, about him being unfaithful in their marriage, and thought that he was having yet another affair. The major indicator for her was that Eli was almost never home, and he was gone way more than usual. It seemed to her like he was always with his friends, or on a fishing trip, or at work. And the times she even bothered to ask him where he had been or what had taken him so long, he would just blow her off and tell her that he was just choring, which is basically just doing chores around the property in the community. It was a really lame excuse, and Barbara knew that because she knew the chores that he had to do and around how long it should take him, and none of it just added up at all. So even though she knew that his excuses were absolute crap, most of the time she just let it slide. Remember, all she ever wanted was a happy marriage and a happy family. Finding her one true love was what she wanted most growing up. And when she married Eli, she thought that he was the one. Even if his actions sometimes said otherwise, she was committed to making it work. Divorce in the Amish community is something that is just not allowed. There is no just getting tired of each other or growing apart from one another or getting in different relationships to the point of a breakup being the necessary option. In their faith, you work on it. You fix things. You can do a separation for a period of time, but that's typically the extent of it. The only time you're allowed to remarry or date is when your spouse passes away. Till death do us part. Literally. No exceptions. So something that Barbara had told both her sister and some of her other close friends in the months leading up to her death was that she was actually scared. Barbara claimed that she wasn't scared of Eli and didn't think that he would hurt her in any way, but she couldn't say the same about some of the women that he was having affairs with. She felt like if any of Eli's girlfriends knew about her, they might be so jealous that they would want her gone. And they would want her gone so badly that they would actually hurt her, since Eli couldn't just break up with her and remarry without being the talk of the town and possibly even shunned again. So this was something really new for the detectives to sit with and to think about. From the outside looking in, it didn't seem like this sweet 30-year-old mother of 5 could have too many enemies. She pretty much kept to herself and her close family and friends. Eli's gunshot residue test came back negative, and his alibi was ironclad, so it didn't seem like he was involved. But it also hadn't been some random crime. There weren't a lot of obvious options left to look into, unless Barbara's fears, of course, had actually come true, and that there was a woman somewhere out there that knew exactly what happened to Barbara. Meanwhile, as investigators were putting together a game plan to look into any possible women who might want Barbara out of Eli's life, a call came in, and it was extremely unexpected. One of Barbara and Eli's neighbors had called the police off of the community phone and had told them that a very odd and concerning voicemail had come in on the community phone and that it needed to be listened to by the detectives right away. So when detectives listened to the voicemail, they were pretty shocked and also confused because the voice over the phone said Eli could run, but he couldn't hide, and that they had gotten the wrong person the night before when they killed Barbara. I mean, so had Barbara just been the unlucky one to have been home that night instead of Eli? Had he been the primary target all along? The motive of a jealous mistress could still apply even if Eli had been the primary target, though. So detectives got right to work in digging up Eli's extensive past, and also a list of possibly present or past mistresses. So just 2 days after Barbara's death, on June 3rd, Eli was again brought in for questioning. Only this time, it wasn't to discuss his alibi or even his relationship with Barbara. Instead, they wanted to know all about his affairs. He admitted very early on in that interview that he had cheated more than once in their marriage, but he was claiming that it had now been years since he had spoken to any of the women that he had had affairs with. But as he continued to be questioned, and the questions would get more in depth about his affairs, he was uncomfortable, and then he didn't answer any of the questions. After a while, he eventually told them that he wasn't going to answer any more questions at all without an attorney present. And once his attorney joined him, they both collectively decided that they were going to end the interview. Detectives knew that Eli was going to keep his lips pretty much sealed, and since they didn't have any evidence against him, they couldn't force him to do anything that he didn't want to do. They knew that they now needed to start looking in other directions, so they decided to turn to the small, tight-knit community. Because gossip and word would spread like wildfire, even in the Amish community, if not even more in the Amish community. They figured if Eli wasn't going to tell them about his affairs, they might be able to piece some information together from some of the people that knew their family best. So during some of the interviews, detectives found out that Eli had not just been unfaithful the 2 times that he had left his family, he had been unfaithful over and over and over again. They found out from some of Eli's friends that he had even gotten one girl pregnant, and she kept that baby. He never met this little girl, but apparently he had been sending $350 per month to that woman that he had once had the affair with, each time writing checks from his store's personal account, all so that he could keep it a secret and on the down low. Now, one thing was pretty common in all of the interviews, and that was that there was a lot of rumors about Eli, and that he had been actually having yet again another affair. Not one from years ago like he had led the detectives to believe, but a current affair happening right now in real time. So like all rumors, not every detail was known, but it seemed like there was one woman who Eli had been referring to as the taxi lady, that he would spend a lot of time with and would take him all over town. Since the Amish don't believe in owning cars, there were certain people in the local community who weren't Amish, but they were able to make a pretty decent living off of driving these Amish people to places that they couldn't get to via a horse or buggy. Sometimes even places that they could, but obviously it would be much faster and less of a hassle. So it's kind of, if you just think about it, it's kind of like your typical Uber, but for the Amish. That's what it is. So other people in the community told the police that they had suspicions that the taxi lady that Eli and other people in the community were referring to was possibly a 39-year-old woman named Barb Rabber, not to be confused with his wife, Barbara. Now, Barb was a Mennonite woman who would drive people around in the community. A lot of neighbors and friends said that they didn't have any specific proof or evidence that Eli and Barb were having an affair, but they were around each other enough and often enough that it was starting to get suspicious. So this was more information that detectives had previously been able to find, so now they started looking deeper into Barb. And apparently, Barb had always had a pretty close connection to the Amish community, because she had been adopted when she was just 6 months old and she had been raised Amish. She met her husband Edward, who was also Amish, but when she was around 22 years old, they both decided for personal reasons that they wanted to leave the Amish and join the local Mennonite church. Mennonites are still pretty conservative when compared to some other religions, but they are much less conservative than the Amish. They are allowed to have cell phones, electronics, TVs, and most important, they can own and drive cars. Now, Barb was pretty smart because since she had grown up in the Amish community and had known a lot of the local people, she had made a pretty decent living off of driving people in the community around once she had joined that Mennonite church and was able to finally drive a car. Now, touching on Barb and Edward's marriage, from the outside looking in, Barb and Edward were living a very typical American dream. They had 3 children together and they lived in this very gorgeous, spacious home. They owned cars and boats, and if you didn't know any better, it looked like their lives could not have been any more perfect. But we know in a lot of these cases that sometimes, honestly, the dirtiest laundry can be hiding behind the most polished and put together doors. So detectives didn't have a whole lot to lose, so they just decided that they would contact Barb to see if she had heard or knew of anything, and maybe she would even admit to a possible affair with Eli. But the first thing that Barb asked when detectives called her and asked if she knew anything about Barbara's death was, "Am I a suspect?" And that made the detectives' jaws drop. They had interviewed person after person in the community, and most people who are more than willing to help and have nothing to hide automatically go to a mindset of, what can I do to help, rather than a mindset of, am I a suspect? So the oddness of it all was something that they did not ignore or take lightly in the slightest. On the phone call, Barb admitted that she and Eli did have a relationship. She told the detectives that she had known him for about 4 years and had met him not long after she had joined the Mennonite church and had started beginning to give people rides. She met him because he needed a ride somewhere, and they apparently immediately hit it off, began flirting, and the rest is history, so to say. She also described their relationship as crossing a lot of boundaries, and it didn't take long for their relationship to just go from flirting to a full-on intimate physical relationship. Barb claimed that they would meet up with each other and be physical and intimate together for the next 4 years until they finally decided to end things, and that was just 6 months prior. She claimed that the breakup was pretty amicable, and they both agreed that their separate marriages could be threatened if they continued their affairs, which I'm assuming it was mainly because both of their spouses probably sensed that something was up. If Barbara had been suspicious, I'm sure that Edward had been suspicious as well. She claimed that once they ended things, she still would give Eli and his friends rides because that was her stream of income, and it would have looked more suspicious, more off, if she started refusing rides from one specific person. Even though she continued with the rides, though, she told detectives that she was never alone with Eli after that. It was always him and his friends that she would drive around. Now keep in mind, this was all over a phone call. So the detectives decided that since she had seemed fairly open, at least more than Eli had been, they now wanted to bring her in for questioning and see if they could get some more information from her, maybe even about where she had been the night Barbara was killed. I mean, she would have a perfect motive after all. So when Barb was asked about her whereabouts that night, she told them that she had actually been the one to drive Eli and his friends to their fishing trip. She claimed that she had gotten back into town with them that night around 11 p.m., had dropped them off, then headed back to her own home, and that's where she stayed all night. She told them that her husband Edward was also home that night, and that he'd be able to verify everything that she told them. But before investigators could even call Edward to talk to him or bring him into the station, another bomb was dropped on them. A 25-year-old woman named Dandy had called the police station with a pretty insane accusation. She told them that she had actually been having an affair with Eli, and that during the time they spent together, he said some pretty outlandish and even concerning things now in hindsight to her, now that his wife had been murdered. Dandy told the detectives that she had met Eli 2 years earlier on an online dating site called Mocospace. His profile described him as being the Amish stud, and Dandy said that the title was what really got her interested in him. Now, Mocospace was a place where you could be in an online chat room, and when detectives looked more into it, they found that Eli talked to many, and I mean many, different women online. Now, in an absolute cringe detail, I get secondhand embarrassment just thinking about it, so I'm going to try not to get the chills saying it. I already have the goosebumps. His profile name was Amish Stud, and his profile subject line was "Who wants to do an Amish guy?" I mean, he wasn't shy on there at all. He posted multiple photos of himself. He was showing off his bare chest, his abs, and that wasn't the only way that he talked to women, because he also had multiple other online chat profiles set up as well. So he was really racking them in. Dandy told detectives that he was talking to her on a cell phone, which she knew he wasn't supposed to have, and she apparently had even questioned him about it one time. He told her about his small business that he owned, and he said that he had the cell phone because he needed to use it for business-related reasons. Dandy claimed that their relationship hadn't lasted long because they decided that they were better off as friends, and they had only met in person a handful of times, many times being at a store, and they would just drink coffee together and they would talk. She told them that they had been friends for a little over a year when Barbara's murder happened. And one thing that she described about Eli was that he was very charismatic and that he did not at all fit the typical Amish man stereotype that you would expect. She said he was outgoing, he was far from shy, and he was very opinionated about many different topics. The main reason she felt like she needed to talk to the detectives, though, was because many times during their long conversations about life, he said things that go from dramatic to a little bit of a red flag once your wife has been murdered in cold blood, such as talking about how unhappy he was in their marriage. And he didn't stop just there, because he often made little comments about wanting to know how to kill people. And one time he even made a comment to Dandy that if she ever saw Barbara out, to run her over. And Dandy told them that the moment that she realized she needed to take a step back from their friendship with Eli was when one day he went on and on about knowing which kind of mushrooms were poisonous, and this was seemingly out of nowhere. She had felt even before Barbara's murder that Eli's behaviors were becoming increasingly weird. So things were starting to look more and more suspicious now, so detectives asked Dandy if she would possibly help them out with possibly getting in contact with Eli, and maybe even getting him to say something that he wouldn't have said to them. But when she tried calling the number that she had been reaching him on, it was disconnected. So that's when they decided as a group that since Dandy didn't have an active account on Mocospace, where she had first met Eli, she would create a new account and she would message him because she knew that he would respond to her right away. And she was right. She had sent him a message basically saying that she had heard so many different things and she wanted to know what was going on. She left her cell phone number in the message, and within minutes, Eli was calling her. He told her immediately about how, since they had last talked, someone had come and murdered his wife. And Dandy thought it was pretty strange that he seemed to show no emotion or concern in any way, shape, or form when he told her what had happened. Now, he must have had some suspicion or inkling that Dandy was working with investigators, because when she asked what happened to Barbara, he told her that he couldn't talk anymore and that he would call her back another time. But she never heard from him again. It might sound like Dandy's help was a dead end, but it was far from it, because now they had this secret phone number of his. They figured if they looked more into the phone records, it would be fairly simple to call his bluff on not having any affairs or the fact that he had claimed he hadn't talked to any of the women in years, right? And Dandy wasn't the only woman who Eli had made some pretty disturbing comments to either. While detectives were looking into Eli's online alter ego as the Amish stud, he contacted multiple women that he had been chatting with, and they all said the exact same things as Dandy. He would talk about how miserable he was in his marriage, and he would make strange comments, sometimes even asking them if they knew of anyone who could come and kill his wife. Now, I'm sure they all didn't think that he was being serious. Extremely odd and a little concerning, maybe. Surely, though, not serious, right? Now, one woman that he was seeing was named Tabitha, and she told detectives that on one occasion, Eli had asked her specifically about rat poisoning. She claimed that he said, "You're smart. Help me figure this out. You can use rat poisoning to kill rats. I don't know anything about poisoning people." He apparently even went as far as saying he was going to put it in Barbara's drink that she drank every night before bed, before then laughing it off and dismissing it as some sort of sick joke. The detectives knew that Eli's secret phone was now their best bet at finding anything that might possibly connect Eli with Barbara's death. At this point, they knew that he was a terrible husband, a terrible father, but unfortunately, that's not exactly a crime that is punishable by law, right? When they looked more into the cell phone, they found that the phone wasn't even in Eli's name, though. It was in Barb's name. So things were now looking a little bit fishy, and they were from the start, but they now knew that their next move was to subpoena the cell phone records so they could see exactly who Eli had been talking to, as well as the things that he was talking about. Once they had the phone records, they immediately saw that Barb wasn't just doing Eli a favor by putting a phone in her name to hide from Barbara and the church. It benefited her as well, because they texted literally 24/7. Based on the most recent texts, it was pretty clear that Barb had lied about the affair being over. All of the text messages were not only flirtatious, but they were also very sexually suggestive as well. These were not the texts of two friends, not at all, and when detectives looked deeper into the text messages between Barb and Eli, they literally hit the jackpot, because there were countless messages discussing how to kill Barbara. And this was all as a means to continue their relationship with each other. A series of text messages on May 30th, 2009 showed the two of them discussing that they needed to investigate more on a specific way to kill Barbara. Barb said to Eli in one of those texts, "If we could get something in her to make her sleep hard and then get a can or two of nitrogen or CO2 gas, we could let it leak out under the bed. It would look like carbon monoxide poisoning." And these horrible calculated texts did not end there. In another series of text messages, Eli explained to Barb that he had purchased rat poisoning and he was considering just poisoning Barbara. And one of the most disturbing texts was when they discussed just blowing up the house. And even in that suggestion, Barb, not Eli, shockingly had been the one to say, "Yeah, but what about your 5 kids, who will obviously be in the house with her as well?" And Eli's response was absolutely disgusting and insane, because he pretty much told her it was no big deal, because they were all so young and so innocent, they would just go to heaven anyway. These are innocent children, his own children, and he could not care any less if they experienced a horrible, fiery death, burning alive. What? They meant absolutely nothing to him, clearly. I mean, thank God that Barb at least had enough sense and empathy to care about those innocent kids, or this whole thing could have been an entirely different, other dark and sinister story, with way more casualties. So as if all of these text messages weren't damning enough, there were also texts between the two of them the night before Barbara's death. In these messages, Barb had expressed how nervous she was and said that she didn't think that she could go through with it. So Barb was definitely showing hesitation, saying over and over again how she was nervous and how she was scared, and she was coming up with excuses like how she didn't know how to get it or where to park or that she wouldn't be able to see it since it was so dark out, all of these things. Eli, on the other hand, seemed more than happy to be so close to getting rid of Barbara, and it was even better that he didn't have to do any of the dirty work. He had an answer for every excuse that Barb was giving, and he sent her encouraging messages all along the way, anytime that she expressed any sort of fear or doubt. Barb had even been trying to cover their tracks through a lot of this, and some of the last text messages between the two explained that she was disconnecting his number and getting him a new one, and she instructed him that no matter what he did, he wasn't supposed to let the police know about his phone, and definitely not give it to them. So after all of this, just days after Barbara's murder, on June 10th, 2009, both Eli and Barb were arrested for the murder of Barbara Weaver.
We treated this as a homicide. We did not treat this as a religious affiliation or anything along that line. A woman was killed, 5 children were left alone. And that's what motivated us to bring this to hopefully a quick closure, at least the start of one.
After they were both arrested, they were able to get a search warrant for Barb's cell phone as well as her laptop, and this just presented even more evidence against the two of them. Barb had been searching endless questions on Google, such as how much poison will kill someone, what kind of poisons kill someone faster, can you die from carbon monoxide poisoning, and just so many others, all about ways to kill someone, as well as the fastest way to get the job done. There were over 800 searches in total. That is so many that I literally can't even comprehend what else she could possibly ask to add up to over 840 Google searches, separate Google searches. That in and of itself is just wild to me. Meanwhile, no big surprise, Eli refused to cooperate with the investigators, and he denied having any involvement in Barbara's death. This Amish stud wasn't about to show any weakness, and he wasn't about to confess to anything right then and there. But just from reading their text messages, it was pretty clear. Eli showed a lot of arrogance, and Barb had been paranoid and worried before anything had even been done. So they knew that if Eli wasn't going to talk, Barb more than likely would, and their suspicions were correct, because Barb immediately started talking. She painted a picture to the detectives about what it was like falling head over heels in love with Eli not long after they met. Their relationship hit a lot of highs, but also it hit a lot of lows. It wasn't an easy relationship. They were always sneaking around, having to schedule when they could see each other and when they could be together, and just constantly sneaking text messages back and forth on Eli's secret phone. Similarly to what Barb had originally told detectives too, they had hit a point literally years into their relationship where things had started to get harder than they had ever been. Eli wasn't dumb. He knew Barbara was catching on, and he knew that something was happening. I mean, she had already been through this at least twice at this point already, so she knew the warning signs. She knew the huge red flags to look for. So it was at this point that Eli started telling Barb that since he couldn't just divorce Barbara, they had to murder her. Barb claimed that he had convinced her and pressured her into it, making her truly believe that there was no other option if they were going to be together. And I think the craziest thing about this case to me is, why didn't Eli just leave Barbara and the kids like he had literally done multiple times before? I also don't understand what made his relationship with Barb any different than all of the other women that he had been in relationships with. I mean, to the point where murder was now the option and going to jail for life, that was the only way out. Every time he left before and came back, he would repent. He would be a part of the church. It wasn't like he was forced. I mean, they could have just easily left their spouses and their children if that's what they wanted to do. And they could have started a new life together in the outside world. If anything, Eli would have been a pro at it by now. He had done it so many times before, right? I mean, third time's a charm. Well, Barb and Eli planned every last detail of the murder together. They thought about all of the ways they could possibly get caught, and they tried to work around them. They knew that as her husband, Eli would be the obvious first suspect, which is why they made sure to plan that he would be out of town on a fishing trip, hoping for some kind of logical alibi. They also knew not to use any of Eli's guns or the guns from the gun store in case he was tested for gunshot residue, like he had been, or if there had been a warrant that was presented for the home or the gun shop. They planned that once Eli had left that night or that early morning for his second fishing trip, he would leave the side door open and unlocked so that Barb could sneak in while Barbara and the kids were still asleep. She decided she was going to use her husband Edward's shotgun so that the murder weapon could not in any way be tied or connected back to Eli. She knew that neighbors in the community look out for one another and that sometimes they see and notice things that you wouldn't typically think somebody would, so she knew not to just park in the driveway. She parked in an area behind a bunch of pine trees so that her car was well out of view, and then she walked the rest of the way to the house through the woods nearby. Once Barb was in the home, however, she immediately started downplaying the situation, and almost in a way like she wasn't willing to confess fully to what she had done. She claimed that as she went through the house toward Eli and Barbara's bedroom, she got cold feet, and that she knew that she couldn't actually go through with killing her. She said that she was scared, and that she decided she wouldn't kill Barbara, she'd only give her a good scare. So she claimed that she was standing over Barbara's sleeping body, planning on what to do next, when then she just accidentally pulled the trigger and shot sleeping Barbara in the chest. Even though Eli had been adamant from the start that he had nothing to do with Barbara's murder, his attorney must have gotten under his skin, or at least talked a little bit of sense into him though, because just weeks later after all of this, he decided to take a plea deal. He would plead guilty and testify against Barb, all in exchange for a lesser sentence. And usually in a lot of cases like this where multiple people are involved in a crime, their attorneys can really put in the work to convince them to beat the other person out for a plea deal. So Eli must have known that even if his case went to trial, there was so much evidence stacked up against him that he had no chance at convincing everyone that he was innocent, not with the very clear paper trail that he and Barb had left behind. Now, for the plea deal to work, Eli had to give investigators a full and truthful testimony. So he sat down with them, and he finally started sharing his side of the story. He admitted that he and Barb had been discussing killing Barbara for a very long time, and also that he never tried to talk her out of it or tell her that it was a bad idea. Unlike Barb's story, though, he claimed that it was all her idea and that she had been the one pushing it the most. He even told them that once Barb got an idea in her head, there was no talking her out of it, including Barbara's murder. Eli showed absolutely no remorse for anything that had been done, and Eli pled guilty on August 17th to complicity to commit murder, and he was sentenced to 15 years to life. And get this, he's eligible for parole this year, this June, just a few months. Now, interestingly enough, Barb was also offered a plea deal, and shockingly, she denied it. She claimed that she was truly innocent and that she had no intent on killing Barbara, and that the shotgun going off had been a complete mistake and a complete accident. She told her attorneys as well as the detectives that she wanted a trial and she wanted a chance to prove everyone of her innocence in all of this. And it's funny how this couple, who had been so willing to kill for the love and lust that they had for one another just weeks before, were now more than willing to pin the blame on each other. It was really every man for themselves at this point. So Barb's trial began on September 16th, 2009. The jury didn't have any Amish people on it because in the Amish faith, they are taught to forgive no matter what. So to make it a fair trial, they were banned from being part of the jury. Barb's defense team continued to argue that Barb never had any intentions on hurting Barbara and only wanted to scare her. All evidence aside, though, my thought process is that I would love to know what Barbara thought scaring her would do, since she knew they still wouldn't be able to get a divorce. Maybe it was just to scare her into staying silent and letting Eli have a mistress. I mean, that excuse just kind of, to me, sounds a little lackluster at best, but that's besides the point. So her team even argued that Barb was just going along with everything Eli was saying so that she could see how far he was willing to go, which again doesn't make much sense considering he wasn't going far at all or doing any of the dirty work. She was. The prosecution argued that through the text messages between Eli and Barb that were literally months and months in the making, as well as all of Barb's Google searches, it clearly showed that there was plenty of premeditation, and that the couple had in fact planned to kill Barbara. The prosecution also brought in a witness who testified against Barb. This man's name was David Weaver, and even though he and Eli share the same last name, they aren't related in any way. But David testified that he had known Barb for around 6 years at the time of Barbara's death and considered them to be very close friends, and at one point had even had a sexual intimate relationship with one another. And David testified that on June 3rd, which was the day after Barbara's body had been found, his old friend Barb called him and asked him to do her a huge favor. Now, if you'll remember, early in the investigation, a voicemail was left on the community phone after Barbara's murder, making it seem like Eli was the target. So if you haven't guessed it already, that voicemail was left by none other than David Weaver. David testified that when Barb made that strange request, he never once questioned it, and he just did it anyway. Now, apparently, Eli had told Barb the day after Barbara's death that she needed to do something to throw the detectives off of their trail, which is when she had called David and asked him to call to hopefully make the investigators believe that Eli was innocent because he was also in danger. So David was also granted immunity for testifying against Barb. Thanks to his plea deal, Eli also testified against Barb. He began his testimony talking about himself, his marriage, and his many affairs. He testified that Barb had been the first one to even bring up harming Barbara in any way. He claimed that when he was complaining about his marriage one day, instead of just being a listening ear and hearing his complaints, Barb had allegedly given him suggestions of what they could do to get rid of her. And when he was describing the marriage that he and Barbara had, he told the courtroom, "I guess I just didn't love my wife the way that I should have." I'll say. During the cross-examination, the defense team tried to say that just because Barb had looked up 841 different searches on basically how to kill someone, it doesn't mean that she was the one who had searched them. They also argued that Eli's timeline of the events weren't adding up. Eli had told the courtroom that he left for his fishing trip and with his friends around 3 a.m., but the defense claimed that the text messages between the two of them could prove his timeline was wrong. They also tried to argue that Eli had been the one to pull the trigger and was the one to actually kill Barbara and had decided to then pin it all on Barb afterwards. Barb recanted on her previous story claiming that she had accidentally killed her and now was saying that she had never even been inside the family's home. They argued that there was no evidence to even prove that she had been in the house. No weapon, no DNA, no fingerprints, obviously nothing despite her previous confessions. So the defense was truly grasping for straws at this point. Nothing they said really hit home for the jurors either, or made a whole lot of logical sense. And in the end, none of their arguments mattered, because after only 3 days of trial, Barb was found guilty of aggravated murder, and she was sentenced to 23 years to life. Even though Eli is eligible for parole this year, Barb won't be eligible until 2032, and she's currently being held at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. And shockingly, I guess commitment is the understatement of the word here, her husband Edward still visits her occasionally. Now as for Eli, even while in prison, Eli still has nothing but women on his mind. In 2015, Eli began writing to Amish women who had recently been widowed, making lots of pen pals, all ironically without husbands. So it will be very interesting to see if he is paroled later this year, and something tells me that if he is, he's going to have women just lined up for him. Now, one positive thing that did come from Barbara's death is that the Amish and the local community of the Amish that Barbara and Eli were a part of now take things like abusive relationships a bit more seriously than they did before. Therapy is something that is now highly encouraged in the Amish community, and Barbara's friends and loved ones have said that they wish that the church hadn't fought so hard for Eli to come back all of those times that he had left, and they wish that divorce had been an option, because they feel like Barbara would still be alive today if it had been.
The tragedy of all of this is Barbara Weaver was the perfect victim. She had no means of defense. She was subservient to Eli, and she really did nothing wrong. She becomes a murder victim, and now you have to think about their children, her children. The children find her. The children now have lost both parents. Barbara's dead. Eli's in prison for a long duration, if not for life.
If that had been their reality, her 5 children may not be living with family members, barely remembering memories of their mother. But that's obviously not something that they can change now. They can only hope for a better future and hope that more women like Barbara aren't met with the same fate. This is a very, very tragic case every way you look at it. Barbara was a 30-year-old woman, 5 children, trying to keep her family whole, keep it intact, doing everything she could, even turning blind eyes to abuse and affairs and all of the things. And in the end, she was killed for it. She was murdered for it. All what? So Eli could stick his peen in other women? It's sick. It is sick and just senseless and beyond tragic. So I really do appreciate you hearing Barbara's story today, because it is just devastating that this woman was met with such an awful fate when all she tried to do was good in the world and love her children and love her nieces and nephews. And it's just it's beyond heartbreaking. So thank you for sticking around and listening, because I know it was a long one. All right, guys, until the next case, please hug your loved ones and stay safe. All right, bye.